Great, right. Now we're off to the start, finally. I thought I wasn't going to give a DEF CON talk then for a bit. Right, cool, okay. Right, so we're going to get started now because we're behind time. So my talk today is some research that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years. I used to work at a large company with a global presence, and based on some of the assets and facilities that they owned, the sort of Russian APT groups were a large focus of my research in that time. So that's the basis of the talk. So it's about Red Russians, how Russian APT groups are following red team research, which was a trend I identified when tracking these threat groups. So a little bit about me. So I'm a senior threat intelligence advisor with Team Cymru, which is a sort of CTI company, network intelligence organization. I've only joined there in April, so that's been good fun to go there. But before that, the last 3.5 years, I was the head of threat hunting at Equinix, which is the world's largest data center company. I used to run the threat hunting program there, so I built it from scratch, built it up, figured out what sorts of tools and data sets we had access to. Sorry, it's Sunday and I've been here a week, my throat's a little bit sore. And it was quite fun there, building everything up from scratch and going ahead and figuring out what adversaries we're interested in, what detections we want to focus on, and figuring out what log sources we have, and what parts of the organization are most likely to be targeted by these types of threat actors. I'm also the co-founder of a trust group, which is basically a group of CTI analysts where we share intelligence amongst ourselves and work together and collaborate on things. I'm also the co-author of SANS 4589, Cybercrime Investigations, and also the co-founder of B-Sides Bournemouth, which is the first time we're running it is actually next weekend, and also the organizer of Bournemouth 2600. So in short, the Russian intelligence services are being a bit lazy here. They're copying and monitoring and scanning what researchers are doing, and then they're incorporating it into their campaigns as soon as this stuff comes out and using it for espionage. The interesting thing about this is, as defenders, we can kind of exploit this ourselves, and we can kind of follow what the red teamers are doing and sort of building detections and things before it's weaponized and exploited in the wild. So in essence, we kind of need to try a bit harder. We shouldn't wait until the adversaries exploited it. We should be, hopefully, the main takeaway from this talk is we should be following red team research and deploying and implementing detections as it's being released. And we can kind of assume some adversary is going to use it. So why this matters? If anyone here is a red team researcher, offensive security tool developer, interesting thing to consider is that when you release this stuff, there are APT groups actively monitoring you and seeing as these tools are released and are going to leverage them to hack the governments and public society and organizations in the countries that you live in, right? Or well, unless you live in Russia. So sometimes think before you release a tool, it's a good idea to maybe help defenders a little bit and explain the technique that you're leveraging so that they can, the guys on your side can develop detections and stuff for it. Because you use those public services, right? And if your hospital goes down or if the energy gets cut off, you are also impacted by it. And blue teamers, you should pay attention to what the red teamers release and research. Don't just go to blue team conferences all the time or listen to blue team talks all the time. Spread out and go and have a look at some of the other stuff, right? And we're going to get into the rest of it within the rest of the talk. So the relevant Russian intelligence services I'm going to be kind of mentioning and bringing up today are the Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, which is kind of consisted of APT28, Fancy Bear, Forest Blizzard. That's kind of the main group and organization that you'll see in many of these reports, and they have been doing this of copying red team research. Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, also known as APT29, Cozy Bear, Midnight Blizzard, threat group that's been around for many, many years. They've hacked all sorts of US government organizations, UK government organizations, NATO organizations, and famous for launching the SolarWinds supply chain attack. And then also the Federal Security Service, the FSB, pretty well known, famously one of the longest running and most technical APT groups out there, also known as Turla or Venomous Bear and Secret Blizzard. I thought I'd add some of the APT names since some of the vendors have started to collaborate and share information about what they call each one. But these groups have been using it. So the first example of one of the more recent examples of this that I observed was M365 device code phishing by the SVR in February of this year. So this is a pretty straightforward campaign where they figured out that if you can trigger kind of a login using the device code, which is kind of usually used for smart TVs, other sorts of things in sort of corporate offices, it's a feature that Microsoft implemented where it's easy to log into things. And essentially, you just need to get a code from someone who has an M365 account. And they created lures that pose as sort of WhatsApp messages, Signal, even Element and Microsoft Teams messages and stuff. And they kind of leverage this to target governments and non-government organizations across multiple regions, US, Europe as well, as you can probably imagine. So the interesting thing about this was that in some of the research where they said this threat group was leveraging this technique, none of the research was saying that this exact technique was disclosed by Black Hills in 2023. So this is already a known technique. It's not a zero-day, it's not an exploit or anything. This is something that a well-known, well-respected red team research sort of organization had shared and shown people how to use. But the number of organizations that probably already had detections put in place for this is probably in the minuscule numbers. As just an example of what this type of attack looked like. For each of these, I'm going to kind of share some detection opportunities log sources. While some of these are probably going to be somewhat old techniques, there are ways to detect these. Not actually that hard. When these blogs come out, you should be able to just scan through them, build some detections, test them out and deploy them. Shouldn't take longer than an afternoon, really. In this one, it was simply just /device login. That was what the users were seeing, and that's what the adversaries were sending to their threat actors. You can see it in source, and they also will add log sources as well. So places where you get URLs, your web proxies, things like Zscaler, and then also email logs as well. So RDP config phishing, another big one that we saw in October 2024, less than a year ago. These were being used to target sort of Ukrainian government organizations, and it spread and hit other sort of UK and US organizations as well. This is pretty straightforward, where they just literally send you an RDP config file to the user runs it, and then they just grab the credentials and sort of remotely connect to the adversary system. And by doing that, they've kind of created a channel between the two systems, and then they can run all sorts of other commands and things to do whatever they want to do next, steal files, deliver additional malware, as you can imagine. Again, this exact same thing was disclosed by Black Hills in February 2022. So the SVR are reading this blog, evidently, in my mind. They've figured out what technology their targets use, and they've gone and researched which vendors publish this research on how to exploit this technology, and just incorporated it into their campaigns. It's not that sophisticated. I feel like the Black Hills and stuff, other organizations, they put such good detail in how to do these and emulate these types of attacks that pretty much any APT group could do this if they wanted to. Again, just an example of what it looks like from the sort of victim's perspective. Just to detect RDP config phishing, again, it's not that difficult. If you see .rdp as email attachments, again, clear sign of something that's going to be pretty suspicious. You never really see that in sort of day-to-day running of a business, people sending RDP config files. So again, and some of the things you want to look for is through the email gateway logs and Windows event logs to detect this stuff. Azure AD, also known as Entra nowadays, which means like come in Spanish, which is quite apt really, because the SVR had been caught doing password spraying attacks against Azure login pages and login fields and stuff. The issue with this was that this had basically been going on for years, and the UK NCSC had put out a report about this, saying they had been doing this for a really long extended time. And the interesting thing about this was that Ars Technica and SecureWorks put out a sort of an advisory saying there was basically a bug in Azure AD where you could just password spray it infinitely. There was no rate limiting whatsoever. So as soon as that news got out, again, SVR straight away will start using this stuff. And it's not until years later that some of this stuff can actually be attributed to these sorts of organizations, because again, they're going to be in the blog. They were saying they were using things like residential proxies. They're using rotating IP addresses. And you have to be kind of a sort of at the intelligence level to be able to analyze and attribute some of this stuff. So, hats off and thanks to the security services for sharing their attribution with us. Yeah, this is a screenshot from the article. Detecting Azure AD and Entra stuff, password spraying. This was kind of a funny one. Of course, if you see multiple failed login attempts, it's going to be examples of password spraying. Not too difficult to spot if you're actually paying attention to this stuff. But at the end of the day, it's also useful. So some of this stuff was very low and slow. So it would be like one request an hour or something like that. So you may not see all of these missed password logins attempts, but you may see the threat actors coming at you from things like VPN exit nodes, from residential proxies and Tor nodes. So it's good to have that IP enrichment to be able to detect that stuff and correlate and see if you're getting a sort of a low and slow password spraying attack. And of course, you're going to have to have a look at the Microsoft Entra ID protection sort of sources to be able to see this stuff. TeamCity, exploited by the SVR in October 2023, so over 2 years ago. This is an interesting one because basically researchers who work for Rapid7 released this as a public exploit after they had discovered it. Fair play to them. They've researched the vulnerability. They've been able to find it. They disclose it to the vendor, and they've kind of done their part of a sort of industry norms in a way. But as soon as that exploit was released, the SVR jumped on it straight. This is probably one of the fastest examples of it. Like within a week, they had grabbed that POC, proof of concept exploit, and started hitting as many organizations as they can with it, including government organizations. And here's an example of the chain of sort of delivery that was included in the advisories about what the SVR was doing. But again, another example of them copying and monitoring and copying. This one wasn't, again, if in these sorts of scenarios, they're targeting organizations that may not have the sort of latest modern security controls, things like endpoint detection and response software, or maybe they're not even running SysMon on some of this stuff. But again, it's not actually too difficult to spot if you do have those controls, because you'll be seeing unusual activity, commands like wget and requests to things like trycloudflare.com running on the Windows server that's hosting your sort of TeamCity applications. Very suspicious stuff. As a threat hunter, I would kind of see this stuff right away. But again, we're thinking about organizations that don't have some of these capabilities. Some of you may work for SOC teams or threat hunt teams or CTI teams, but they're probably very well-resourced organizations, right? But yeah, if you work for an MSSP as well, it's another example of something to hunt for, something to detect. Microsoft Teams phishing. This was a funny one because as soon as Microsoft announced this feature where a user and an external tenant could message another user and another tenant, I was literally, I realized straight away, APT groups are going to be using this. There's some features that come out you just know are going to be abused. And again, this was another example of as soon as this stuff started to get talked about, as soon as some of the tools start to be developed and shared, the APT groups have jumped on it straight away and started spear phishing. A lot of the sort of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and government agencies, military organizations, and a lot of the targets of these types of campaigns have been within the sort of sphere of involvement with the Ukrainian war in Ukraine and invasion by Ukraine by Russia. This is an example of what it looks like. You get a message from a user in an external tenant, and basically the user would just click on it, and then they ask you for a code. You enter the code, and they've taken over your account. Detecting Microsoft Teams phishing, a little bit trickier because it's using legitimate infrastructure, right? You're seeing suspicious emails involving the legit on Microsoft.com domain, and they kind of either compromising tenants or using valid tenants that they've spun up or either to send and spearfish this stuff. I guess the easiest way to deal with this is literally just turn off external access in Microsoft Teams. If you've not done it already, definitely please do that. and it wasn't too long that sort of the cybercrime ransomware groups, things like Darkgate affiliated with Black Bastard, had started using that as well. But SVR was ahead of the game. HTML smuggling. This is back in May 2021. This is hopefully underscoring like how many years they've been doing this, and I've been seeing it over and over again. But I didn't see any of the sort of APT researchers, the organizations that are tracking this stuff, linking it back to research that's already been published. So this campaign is going on in May 2021, but this technique has already been blogged about, leveraged by red teamers since 2018. So in theory, if it's that long ago, everyone should be aware of it, have detections in place for it. The security tools should have detections in place for it. And there's quite a bit of lag time and opportunity for you to detect this and catch this stuff. HTML smuggling is an interesting one because basically you send an HTML file and it basically decodes into a ISO file, an image file, which is kind of a container for other sort of file extensions as well. You'll have executables and DLLs and stuff inside of there. It gets mounted when you execute it, and then basically a PDF will appear. So to the user, they just click on the attachment of the email, and then a PDF appears on their system. Meanwhile, it's gone in the background, it's decoded it, and it's expanded it, and then run sort of malware in the background. I think it was also using DLL sideloading of some of the Adobe Acrobat applications. So detecting HTML smuggling, sideloading in acrosup.exe, mounting. This is probably something you may want to look into. It's just a general mounting of ISO files by explorer.exe. Sometimes you'll get some users, maybe IT personnel, using that legitimately. But if you see, Karen in finance doing it, you're like, hold up, what's going on here? The outbound connections to the Dropbox API, again, if Dropbox is like a sanctioned SaaS application or a sanctioned application inside of your organization, then you may have a trickier time detecting malicious activity related to it. But again, if one of the main things of being a threat hunter is to understand what's normal in your environment, what's allowed in your environment. If some of this stuff isn't allowed, then you're going to want to investigate or just block it. ClickFix, again, this is an interesting one. John Hammond released a tool on GitHub in September 2024. There was some discussions of threat actors using it or other researchers playing around with it, and then he decided to release this tool to raise awareness about the problem, legitimate concern. But as soon as he did that, all sorts of threat actors started using it as well. And one of the most interesting and notable ones was that CERT Ukraine observed APT28, Russian GRU, had been using this exact technique to be able to spearfish people. And this is an interesting one because it basically appears like a captcha verification, and it pops up. You press Windows R. The code is already copied to your clipboard, and then you press Windows V and it just runs the script. And all sorts of cyber criminals have been using this as well, but it was just interesting to see an APT group hop on it and try it straight away. Detecting ClickFix is a little bit trickier because some of this is going to need things like full PowerShell script block logging, which not all EDRs do, that I came to learn when I was working at my last place. And it is just generally a trickier technique to be able to detect and run because it's inviting the user to basically copy and paste the script and run it. If that user is like basically already a local admin, again, if you think you're running with a high privileged context, you're going to be able to open that back door on that system. Some people recommend doing sort of clipboard monitoring to detect this kind of thing, and it's depends on the context of the organization. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that because then you have a treasure trove of data in there that an APT is going to go after as well. But a tricky one definitely is more recent, so I definitely recommend reviewing this one if you've not done so already. And this was a timeline I've built up. This is a nice example of basically all the research that events and incidents that have appeared over the last 4 or 5 years. As I've been researching these threat actors, I've just noticed this as a trend of something they like to do, and I'm kind of sharing that with you guys today to be able to take note of who's releasing this research, or when a new piece of research comes out that's pretty, interesting, a little bit spicy, involving Microsoft 365 in particular, or targeting, running a sort of a pre-auth exploit, those sorts of POCs that appear on GitHub. If you see this stuff, take note of it and start playing around, start building detections for it. Don't sit back and wait for the APT report to come out, because sometimes it's going to be years before, we actually know about this stuff. The other thing to note with this timeline is that it can be years, but in other cases, they can actually do it really quickly. So the Microsoft Teams phishing tool, as soon as that was released, literally the next few days, probably after that was released, they started using it. Same with the Microsoft TeamCity exploit. If you release one of these tools, it just goes to show threat actors are using it straight away as soon as you drop that and make it public. So think before you click, make public on that GitHub repo, right? Another resource that I've created that should be useful for people here is a GitHub project called the Russian APT tool matrix. Essentially, I've gone through my research over the years, or mentioning all these different APT groups and what tools they use in their campaigns. While they do use quite a lot of legit not legit malware, while they use a lot of legitimate tools but they also develop custom malware. It's legitimate tools that are things that are it's a variable that we can kind of see being reused, and it's something that's more likely to stay the same than a piece of malware that's going to be custom with the custom, command and control communications mechanisms as well. These are broken down into different categories. So we have the credential theft tools, defense evasion tools, discovery, exfiltration, all this sorts of stuff that you can go ahead and build detections for, and you're making it harder for the APT groups to operate inside of that in your environment. Here's just an example of Cozy Bear, which is the SVR's, Nick CrowdStrike's name for the SVR. They have quite a wide range of tools that they use. So they'll use a lot of the red team stuff for enumeration and discovery inside of Microsoft 365 environments. They're going to be using EDR detection disabling tools, EDR Sandblast, all sorts of interesting credential theft, Mimikatz. Pretty much every APT group has been seen to use that, as far as I can see. And then lots of different OffSec tools. So they're running Cobalt Strike, Impacket, Sliver is a pretty popular one. They've also been observed using Brute Ratel C4, which was kind of released as cracked on the cybercrime underground. And that's kind of potentially how they managed to get their hands on that. Exfiltration. I think Recorder Future's done some great stuff on looking at the different exfiltration techniques that they've been using to basically leveraging those APIs to do communications with their malware. So I kind of just listed the different SaaS applications, cloud file sharing applications that they use to do that. Intelligence-driven threat hunting and engineering. This is kind of example of my process of when I was at my last job. So the CTI team would do the collection, the reporting, the IOC and TTP sharing, and then the dissemination to the threat hunting team. In some cases, I was both those people. I was the one doing the collection and reporting, and then going and searching and analyzing and creating rules around it. It may be the same in some of your organizations as well. But then you kind of I worked with the security engineering team to do that rule vetting, rule deploying, and rule refining. This is where you've gone and created queries for activities that you think or that you've observed and seen reported. But then you're also need to see, like, if that rule is deployed, is it actually going to detect something when it's run on that system? So you can kind of, in this regard, you have to kind of do a little bit of adversary emulation. You're going to have to be running tools, extracting the artifacts from some of these tools, and leveraging those as well. And the next slide is pretty much the QR codes to the rest of the resources. So feel free to scan those quick if you want. And thanks for listening. Thanks, everyone. I don't think we have any time for a question because we started late.